Hello, Africa and the world. Thank you immensely for joining us on this first edition for the month of March 2024 of our #1 Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Today we shall be discussing the ongoing crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo with respect to what's happening in Burundi, where dozens of Burundian troops have been detained for refusing to be deployed to the eastern Congo in the fight against the M23 rebel group as it advances towards a major border city of Goma, according to sources in the African nation. Clashes between M23, which the U.S. says is backed by Rwanda, and Congolese troops have intensified in recent weeks, with the rebels threatening the city or Congolese city of Goma on the Rwandan border. Let's recall that Burundian President Evariste Ndayishimiye, in a public broadcast on December 29, 2023, acknowledged the presence of Burundian troops in eastern Congo under the terms of a defense pact with the Congolese authorities. Tensions have been rising in Africa's Great Lakes region as Rwanda, Burundi and Congo trade accusations of over-support of violent rebel groups operating in the lawless areas of eastern Congo. Congolese President Felix Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo has recently accused Rwanda's government of at least actively supporting the M23, which controls the swaths of territory near the Rwandan border. Let's note that the United Nations experts have cited solid evidence that members of Rwanda's armed groups were conducting operations in support of the rebels in eastern Congo, accusations that Rwanda has denied. At the same time, Burundi is accusing Rwanda of supporting another Congo-based rebel group opposed to Burundi's government. A group known as the Red Tabara has claimed responsibilities for multiple deadly attacks inside of Burundi. In the course of today's edition of Talking Point, we shall be analyzing this recent move by Burundian troops to reject, of course, to be deployed to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course asking the question, what does this say about regional stability, regional solidarity? Ladies and gentlemen, join us in the course of today's edition of Talking Point. Stay with us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, you're welcome on board. This is Talking Point over your Pan-African media, For You Media Africa. You're watching us on For You Television and listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3 For You Radio. And of course, we should reiterate that we are streaming on our respective social media platforms. Today, we're discussing the crisis plaguing the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we respect to that Burundian government has detained some dozens of troops in the African country, those that have refused to be deployed to the eastern Congo to fight the M23 rebel group. So to analyze this topic of discussion, we have as guest Dr. STANLEY FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist journalist all the way from the U.S. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome on board.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon, and thank those who are watching and everyone who will be gaining something from this and those who are supporting this show as well.
Exactly, like Africans would say, finding African solutions to African problems. In a bit, just to reiterate, you shall be bringing to the table insightful analysis with regards to today's topic of discussion. But before we dive right into analysis, let's welcome this report done for us by Bukamarambi for You Media Africa.
The dozens troops from Burundi's military were being held in at least 4 prisons across the Central African country, highlighting in a public broadcast. In December 29th, Burundian President Evariste Ndayishimiye highlighted, I quote, "If you do not help your neighbor, put out the fire when its house is burning. Tomorrow, if it's your turn, he will not come to help you," end of quote. He said this while adding that Burundi's help is actually a defense rendering to itself. As he says, it is normal for Burundian soldiers to be killed on Congolese territory. Currently, some Burundian troops have refused to be deployed to DR Congo, where clashes have erupted between M23 group, which, according to the United States, are being helped by Rwanda. The DR Congo troops are intensifying their force as the rebel groups threaten the city of Goma on the Rwanda border. President Felix Tshisekedi of DR Congo accuses Rwanda's government of actively supporting the M23 rebels. Burundi as well says Rwanda renders support to another DR Congo-based rebel group opposed to Burundi's government, known as the Red Tabara, in which it recently attacked on Sunday and left 9 dead. Rwanda, on its part, has denied all allegations levied against the nation. More than 200 soldiers were detained, with others being dismissed and others acquitted.
Thank you, Buka Marambi, for that report. Like we mentioned, we have been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is our expert for today in the bid to analyze today's today's topic of discussion in the course of today's edition. And now, Stanley, like we mentioned, you have listened to the report. Now, first and foremost, what is your overview of this current crisis plaguing the Democratic Republic of Congo and the growing trend of nations accusing each other of fueling insecurity in the region?
I think we need to, first of all, be able to take a little bit of a pause and try to understand exactly what has been the history of this region for over 4 decades. 3 decades ago, 30 years ago, there was a massive genocide that literally swept across the Rwanda, and that was one of the worst human atrocity that we have seen in the 20th century. And that in itself was something that literally became a stain even on the consciousness of humanity, on the consciousness of the United Nations, where more than 800,000 people died in 100 days. That, and not with the hands of AK-47s, with the hands of machete. I think that if any of us knows anything about Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide was literally one of the worst in human history. That being said, it's been 30 years now, and that's 1994, it's been 30 years now, and one of the remnants of that pain is actually the creation of the M23. And M23 literally moved into the DRC with one goal in mind, and that was to flush out remnants of those who committed the worst atrocity in Rwanda. And most of them are holding positions. They are hanging out in the DRC. Some of them ran to South Africa. They basically, seek refuge wherever they could. But most of them are holding guns and actually running some of the militias that are in the DRC with the zeal and the idea that someday they will be able to emerge back, and basically take over Rwanda. And that's what is going on. So there is a confluence. It's serious, merging of will in the DRC area, and this is from countries like Rwanda, from countries like Burundi, from countries like Uganda, that border these nations to the east, and they will do whatever it takes to be able to maintain their sovereignty. And unfortunately, Rwanda has become, the DRC rather, has become a place where if they are opposition parties in these nations, you're talking about Rwanda, you're talking about Burundi, you're talking about Uganda, they run over into DRC and to create this, to basically use DRC as their launching pad, to fight their individual nations. We are not just looking at the DRC, we are looking at the DRC becoming, a playground for militia groups, a playground for paramilitary groups that are operating, and mercenaries that are operating in these zones for different governments. And unfortunately, the DRC, it's basically suffering from something that she knows little or nothing about.
Exactly, that is what we shall be discussing in the course of this edition. But then we're seeing the Burundian government detaining its troops for not wanting to be deployed to a particular area. Is that right? Because this is something, those are the people who actually go to fight on the battlefield. They are the ones being killed in the midst of these crossfires, because they're trying to ensure that, say, countries are being safe and secure for the masses. Now, is it just for the government to be able to detain them because of the refusal to take part in the fight against this conflict that is going between the M23 and the Congolese government?
I think we need to have a little bit of a backdrop also as to what's happening, in Burundi. First of all, this will not be the first time that Burundi will basically be sending either militias, armed groups
Yeah,
into
exactly.
the DRC. And so this is as far back as 2016, that Burundi literally began sending its youth wing of I think it's called the Ibonakure, youth party, the youth link of that party, which is the ruling party, back then in Burundi. And they did this, to go into Burundi so that they could combat, what you talked about, which is the Red Tabara. And unfortunately, the idea is that Burundi is doing whatever it takes to be able to also maintain some kind of its own sovereignty. And I like the fact that Burundi is actually quite Pan-African in its nature. But the truth of the matter is, just like we said earlier, Burundi is literally combating groups in the DRC that it opposes. But then there is also an issue, because now that simply means that you become friends because of your own objective, at the expense of you also messing with other friends who are enemies to your friend. So the M23, for example, and other militia groups in the DRC that are that are literally part of the group that wants to be able to bring down Rwanda. You look at countries like Burundi is in partnership, is working side by side with these particular groups, and therefore there are also, threats coming from Rwanda as it regards to Burundi literally, helping fighting alongside groups that are fighting against Rwanda. So it's actually a very messy situation, and the truth of the matter is we need help, and I think that the Eastern Bloc need help. If not, we will be looking at a serious issue between Burundi, between Rwanda. Of course, the DRC is no man's land as it stands, and obviously Uganda.
Definitely, we shall be getting your insight with more with regards to today's topic of discussion. Now, why do you think that these troops are rejecting moving to the DRC to combat the M23? And does this evoke the question of lack of solidarity within the sub-region?
Look, if I was part of this particular group, and unfortunately, what's fortunate or unfortunately, if you look at exactly what the motto for or the meaning of the word Imbokore, which is basically the group the group that we're talking about. If you look at in Burundi, if you look at exactly what that means, I think it means for those who see the future. And the idea is that why will I have to go into a particular group, into the DRC, and fight for what? When I clearly understand that the reason to which I'm being sent in the DRC is not legitimate. I think that we have come into a place where soldiers are beginning to understand that we cannot just take marching orders to our death. We cannot just take marching orders to inflict havoc on the lives of many. In 2016, I think close to about 40 soldiers were literally killed by Burundi for refusing to participate in this madness, and a lot of them were actually jailed as well. So the reality is we have to find ways of, to bring dialogue rather than, trying to solve our issues with the barrel of a gun. Soldiers too get tired, and in this case, the Burundian soldiers are just too tired to fight the war they know nothing about.
It's true that no conflict can be resolved through the barrel of the gun, but then in the course of this edition, now, you said we have had several presidents like Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, we've seen William Ruto of Kenya, and a host of experts like yourself that have reiterated the need for, say, Africa to actually get to a standstill where they can be able to sit on a dialogue table and resolve their respective conflict. But then, aside dialogue, when we're speaking of alternatives to calming down tensions in African nations, what other alternatives could be explored for looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, looking at other conflicts on the African continents? What alternatives could experts explore in a bid to calm down those tensions?
You know, there are, I think, many, many ways in which we can be able to solve these issues. And I think that we can actually look at this a little bit more carefully, especially when we have an overview as to what the continent looks like. If you have a panoramic view of the continent, you'll fully understand that the DRC on its own is not like any other part of the continent. We can talk about solving issues in Nigeria, you know, in more ways than basically talking about having free and fair elections, basically having integration, having all parts of the country participate in the democratic process. That's fine. We can basically talk about the places like the Sahel, where we're trying to take care of issues of insecurity, food scarcity, and then talk about the whole entire issue when it comes to Islamic terrorism. That's easy to solve. When you come into the DRC, the problem with the DRC is this, that the DRC is just a melting pot of everybody's issues. Number one, everybody is in the DRC for what they can get out of the DRC. Number two, countries that surround the DRC have militias group in the DRC that's actually trying to be able, you know, to mount enough support so that they can invade their countries of origin and basically take power. So the DRC is literally suffering, just like I said, from something that she knows nothing about. To solve the problems of the DRC, it has to be, you know, a concerted effort from the international community. I think that United Nations literally needs to be able to do more than trying to loot the DRC as she has done consistently. There are video evidence of that, and the United Nations is actually guilty of the same crimes that she is accusing other nations of committing. America basically needs to step back and literally, you know, just move away from that region. Europe has to move away. Russia has to move out. We need to allow that portion of the land to Africans, and I think that Africans have the capacity to be able to solve this issue. And what that means is this: 3 nations or 4 nations has to come to a table and have these conversations, you know, deeply. Number one, Rwanda needs to be present, Burundi needs to be present, Uganda needs to be present, and the DRC needs to be present. There has to be a coalition of these 4 nations that discuss the issues that is, you know, the issues that has basically pushed the DRC to become a launching pad for all attacks across the Central Africa, the East African bloc. We need to be able to look at that, and then you want to include Kenya, Tanzania, and all those other countries, you know, that will benefit from this, then that would be good. But to basically use an umbrella approach where you have, like we're trying to solve issues on the African continent, and then, you know, we can go to do certain things in certain areas. The reality is that when it comes to the DRC needs a whole lot more than any other part of the continent. And for us to be able to solve that, these 4 countries need to come together and basically decide the future and the fate of their nations.
Exactly. It's all about unity, and they say unity is strength. Now, we've been evoking this issue of African solutions to African problems, and you mentioned in your latest analysis that it needs solving the problem in the DRC needs concerted efforts coming from the international community. We should reiterate that the U.S., for instance, in recent times have accused Rwanda of fueling the conflict in the DRC. Now, with this already in mind, you said they have to get to a dialogue table. Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and other nations that are neighbors to the Democratic Republic of Congo would be able to come to the dialogue table, not forgetting that the people causing this instability, we're looking at the M23, would equally need to be on that same table. But with this in mind, do you think that this African solution to African problems applies to every context?
Yes, I think that, and look, if that was not the case, even if that was not the case, I make it the case. And the reason for that is because I don't think that we can sit on the sidelines of history and allow other people to come and decide to us exactly how we have to live our lives. These are the same people. Anyone we are inviting will be those who were instrumental in the worst atrocity on the African continent, which is the issues of slavery. If we're inviting the Arabs to the table, then those are the guys who enslave us more than anybody else. If you're inviting the Europeans, they ship more Africans out of Africa into the West Indies more than anybody else. So the question becomes, who are we inviting? Are we inviting the people who basically give to us the blueprint for slavery? Are we inviting the people who give to us the blueprint, for colonialism? Are we inviting the people who have been instrumental in basically making us marginalized feel like we're chimpanzees running the Amazon? No, we basically call ourselves, because we're smart, we're educated, we are a whole lot more powerful than they can imagine. We are leading in every single index so far as the Human Development Index is concerned. True, as individuals, we are doing very well. We are leading in tech companies all across the world. We are leading in aerospace companies all across the world. We are doing very well. The largest populations actually of those in America that are in the tech space, most of them are actually not even born Americans. Most of them are either Indians and Africans. So Africans are actually lagging behind Indians in the United States in the tech space, but in the medical field, I think Africans are actually leading. You will not step over into any hospital in the United States of America and you will not find a Nigerian that is a medical doctor, a surgeon, a neurosurgeon, and the list goes on. That's the reality of who we are. We are doing well. The idea that we have to sit back and then allow Europeans to come and, basically broker peace among us is crazy. We have the capacity to broker our own peace. And the reason why we have not been able to have any kind of sustainable peace on the African continent is because a white man, a Caucasian, all right, a slaver, someone who was instrumental in Africa's slavery and colonialism, is the one sitting on the table and telling us what to do. When African presidents comes over to the United States of America to sit down and listen to somebody like Joe Biden, they are listening to a slaver. His father was a slaver. His ancestors basically were slavers. That's a fact. Okay, it's historically written. All right, you're looking at somebody who is a descendant, of people who enslaved you to lecture you on your own freedom. That's madness. You must be smoking something that nobody knows about. The reality is we Africans are responsible for our own freedom. We are responsible for our own emancipation. We are responsible for our own deliverance. Help is coming from nowhere, but from another African. Africa needs to be able to take this fight and deliver ourselves, from the remnants of all that, has happened to her in the past. And the same idea that we have to be able to call the United Nations is crazy. Let Africa take care of its own problems. The AU is influenced by the West. Let us find ways in which these 4 countries can be able to sit down together and they'll put an end to this madness. Once the Pan-African spirit sweep across, the minds and hearts of these people, there will be no reasons to fight anyone. We are one. We are Africans. We are black.
Exactly. In the course of this edition, we are pushing for the spirit of Ubuntu, the spirit of oneness, the spirit of togetherness, the spirit of solidarity. Now, when we listen to you, you said that the international community does have its role to play, but you cited some countries that will have to leave for the Democratic Republic of Congo or for Africans to be able to resolve their issues. Now, looking at a dialogue table with all parties being involved, do you actually see how feasible is it for, say, international actors to actually stop meddling, say, in the issues of the DR Congo for the problem to actually be resolved?
The reality is that if I was going to be as blunt as it takes, for us to be able to solve the issues in the DRC, we first of all must put our eyes clearly on those who are not Africans. So we need to sanitize the land of those who are not Africans. And if we do not do so, then we'll have issues. The reasons being that those who are non-Africans in the DRC, they are there for nothing else but minerals, natural resources. They are raping the land as fast as anybody else can. So, the reality is they come with the guns, they have the missionaries, they have men, military contractors, people who are going to fight to their death, because obviously there is millions of dollars waiting for them back home. The reality is if we don't get these men out of the DRC, we are wasting our time. We need to get them out of the DRC, and then we should now be able to focus on those who have legitimate issues in the DRC. I'm talking about the 120-something, militia groups, most of which after we have basically, expel every other person else out of the DRC, then that militia group probably cut down into half, because most of those militia groups are actually being sponsored by foreigners. And there are a lot of military contractors, which very few people know about, in the DRC that are working for foreign governments and foreign organizations, all right? And there are companies that Apale will not name, but there are a lot of companies, major brands in America that has militia groups in the DRC. all right? They have militia groups in the DRC. If we're able to just take care of foreigners, I'm talking about foreigners, invaders, people who are invading the land, if we're just able to take care of them, we solve half of the problems we know in the DRC. And if that was going to happen, what eventually will be is this, that we will be able to now sit on the dialogue tables as brothers. We cannot sit on the dialogue tables as brothers when you have, you know, a white person, you know, whispering into the ear, you know, of another black person as to what their interest is, but not to what the interest of the African is. We need to sit down on the table that is comprised of Africans, not Europeans, or with that European influence, just Africans.
Like you mentioned in your preamble, Burundi initially had troops on a peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but recall that in November last year, the Burundian president announced that nearly 1,000 of those Burundian soldiers had left the Democratic Republic of Congo as part of a phased withdrawal from the regional force after Kinshasa refused to extend its mandate. But again, on December 29, like we mentioned, Burundian government announced it was in collaboration with the DRC in a bid to fight the M23. And now, with this in mind, we have Burundi that is dealing with the Red Tabara, like we mentioned, and all through our analysis. Now, is it this question? Here's my question. Isn't this paradoxical that Burundi happens to be fighting or helping DRC fight the M23 when it's yet to handle the Red Tabara?
Obviously, and then in fighting the M23, you're also at crosshairs with Rwanda. So Rwanda is literally being drawn into this whole entire madness, reasons being that Rwanda clearly is using the M23 to be able to go after, you know, those who committed the worst atrocities in human history. That's just what it is. They did that in South Africa. There was a time when there was a lot of killings taking place in South Africa, and frankly speaking, those who were dying, you know, were basically those who committed the worst atrocities in human history, so far as I'm concerned, which is on the African soil, that which took place in Rwanda. And so you basically, you know, put two and two together, and you realize, you know, somebody in Rwanda was actually pulling, you know, the switch. Somebody was involved in basically orchestrating and setting that up. My point is this, that if you look at Burundi, Burundi has to be extremely very careful. And the reason for that is because you cannot immerse yourself into the DRC on the basis of the fact that you're trying to help a nation, because frankly speaking, the DRC is not even a nation. The DRC is no man's land. How many people are actually ruling in the DRC? How many people have, you know, how many people have militia groups in the DRC? Burundi is just one. Burundi has militia groups in the DRC, and of which even the DRC had no idea about, even as far back as 2016, that there were actually paramilitary groups operating in the DRC by Burundi, and the DRC had no knowledge of that. All right, and they were working in partnership with some elements of the DRC military. We have to be able to come into a place where we basically state that let Burundi and Rwanda and the DRC and Uganda, let these countries basically come to a place, a consensus, where they can actually be able to take care of their issues by themselves. The notion that we are using military groups and paramilitary groups to be able, and rebel groups, to be able to go and destabilize nations and fight each other on another person's stuff, basically, you know, it's putting DRC where DRC is today. Obviously, you know, there's a lot more in DRC than these other countries can ever imagine. So the DRC is not just a launching pad, it's also where guys are basically enriching themselves from natural resources that they can basically ship out of the country, you know, when no one is watching. And that's what's happening with the DRC today.
We think that these nations in alliance are actually accusing Rwanda of fueling their conflicts, because first we saw the DRC and now we're seeing Burundi that has joined the queue.
Sorry, I didn't get that again. The first part of your question, I didn't get that.
Okay, so I was asking that, in your opinion, why do you think that as nations in alliance, Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi, accusing Rwanda of fueling the tensions in their countries? We first saw DR Congo, and now we're seeing Burundi that has recently joined the queue.
Well, see, first of all, Burundi has been accused by the United Nations of basically having a militia group in the name, of a youth wing of their party, 50,000 strong. They have actually been labeled also has been rebels. This is according to the United Nations. And so if Burundi is coming to start fighting against M23, one wonder if they're just trying to be, to start fighting with alongside M20, with M23 against M23 rebels rather. One will wonder if they are trying to be able to be in the good books of the United Nations. Aid into Burundi was literally cut off. A lot of things that Burundi was enjoying, that was taken away from them. And so now I'm not sure whether they are just trying to, come onto the bandwagon of good nations, so that the master, which is the United States and Europe, can be able to look at them and says, good boy, you're doing great, you're doing exactly what we want you to do, and so this is exactly good for you. Or I wonder if they're actually interested in basically bringing any kind of peace and stability in that part of the world. We have legitimate problems, true. The reality is, I'm not too sure why Burundi is, going against M23 in partnership with the DRC. There are a lot more militia groups in the DRC than M23 rebels. Okay, so we have to start asking ourselves these questions, because the moment you start doing that, then Rwanda will have no other choice but to basically, do what Rwanda always does, which is support M23. And in that light, we're looking at, a broader regional conflict than just what's happening in the DRC alone.
Opinion, how can African leaders reinforce the spirit of solidarity amongst themselves, so we don't have the impression of division amongst African states or African leadership?
Well, if we start living in ways that we understand that no one else around the world really cares. The reality is that whenever you leave the continent and you travel anywhere around the world, the truth of the matter is that you're black. And what that means is that you look at somebody who is totally disenfranchised, someone who is basically poor, someone who is suffering, somebody who is coming from a war-torn nation, continent, somebody who basically lives in trees, someone who, lives with animals. You are really not considered to be a human, especially when you go to some of those European nations and some U.S. cities, to say the least, and just see the level of ignorance that exists among white folks and, unfortunately, some African Americans as well. The reality is this: if Africa really wants to emerge from where she is and basically take the stance and do what it is in her best interest as Africans, we have to be able to look among ourselves for our own salvation. We have to look among ourselves, for our own breakthrough. I think that Africa has come of age. Africa has what it takes. Africa has developed a lot of our own children to be able to bring solutions and meaningful, lasting peace in areas, that we are actually having great difficulties. The reality is this: if you look at all of our areas in Africa, especially those that are heavily, endowed with mineral resources and natural resources, you will discover that those are the areas that has most of the highest conflict. And the reason for that is because there are a lot of outside influence that comes to a place like the DRC. Can you imagine a place like the DRC, that one of the worst countries on the African continent with poverty, and God knows what is actually the DRC? If you have a country like America, for example, United States of America, talking about the whole entire idea about sustainable development, fine. The whole entire idea about going green, fine, it's good. Let's go green. Let's have some kind of a sustainable development. Let's talk about global change. And it used to be global warming, now it's global change. You have somebody like Joe Biden basically saying, oh, you know what, every single car in America has to be on green technology. They have to be EV cars, electric vehicles. Good, that's good. The problem is the lithium battery, okay, and cobalt and everything else that is useful for basically putting that vehicle together, it's literally being manned out of the DRC. 30% of cobalt, I think, in the world's deposit is actually in the DRC. Artisan miners are so unskilled in what they do in such a way that they have messed up the water table all across the region. which also means that children are born with cleft palates, and they have all kinds of deformities as a result of the hot water that they are consuming. It is so bad that you can't even take waters from streams, to water anything, because then the crops actually die as a result of the hard minerals, metal content of the water. So here we are in a place where you have another nation pushing for green energy at the expense of the Central African region, and this is as far as Central Africa all the way to the DRC, because they can do that, because they have the capacity and the power to do so. So while we are killing ourselves and dying, our soil is also dying. They are taking our mineral resources. Meanwhile, the African is absolutely doing nothing. We have to come to a place where we understand that if there be any fool on this table, it's us, it's Africa. If there be any idiot that is actually still talking, it's an African. And the only reason is because we are the ones who basically are getting the worst end of the bargain. We are dying. Our resources are being taken away from us, and our land is also dying. Once the resources is gone, once all the minerals have been extracted, we'll have nothing to farm on. And as a matter of fact, while the West will still have very good land, all right, that they can do whatever they can do on their own land in the West. The West is not mining as much as we are. The West is not messing around with their own natural resources as much as we are. We are the only ones who are messing around with our own natural resources. We are gaining nothing in return, and our land is being decimated. That means land that is no longer going to be good for agriculture. And even if in the future we start farming on those lands, we'll be exposed to all forms of cancer as a result of this aggressive form of mining that is taking place on the continent of Africa, where mercury is being used to watch gold, and all kinds of stuff is being used just in the artisan mining process, basically messing up the whole entire landscape. We have to come into a place where we start looking at ourselves and telling ourselves we got to do better. Do better as Africans. Africa needs to take care of African issues with an African eye, an African mind, an African desire, with Africa in the future.
Africa needs to do better for it to be able to attain that level in which it sees itself in future. Now, with that in mind, do you see a continent void of conflict achievable?
Yes, once you take away all the white folks. Once you take away all the Chinese folks and everybody in between, once Africa basically come, and that does not necessarily mean that you basically have to go with the barrel of a gun and start looking for where you find white people. No, that basically means that if we have any white person on the continent of Africa, let that person be a tourist. You are involved in nothing. You're not telling us anything. We are responsible for what is it that we want. And then when the African by themselves begin to understand that a white man is not a solution, it's so stupid. It's so crazy. I have heard these stories over and over again, and I've been involved somewhat in some of this, where you show up to a government, you tell the government, or in one of our African nations, you tell the government, you know what, I'm able to construct data centers. I build data centers. I've been doing this for 20 years. And then they're like, okay, well, you know what, so what do you want to do? I want to construct this particular data center. This is what we need. We need this because the country needs this. And then they go, oh, you know what, well, we don't know about it, whatnot. And then a company like Huawei, the Chinese company Huawei, shows up in Cameroon and construct a data center for Cameroon, and then I show up in the same country to see if I could be able to build a data center for them, a percentage of the price. Now, the contract goes to somebody else. A couple of years later, I show up, and then Huawei has come to the country, I think the tune of 7 billion, Huawei. 7 billion to revamp, all right, to basically update a data center. And my question was this: 7 billion CFA, or I think it was 7 billion CFA, to upgrade a data center. My question was, what data center are we upgrading in the first place for 7 billion? All right, can I see the data center? Can I just see the data center that we're upgrading for 7 billion? Oh, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And the idea was, I was being brought in. The idea was that I was supposed to somewhat, I was beaten to somewhat, control Huawei for what Huawei was going to do. Because I asked those questions, obviously that was the end of it. But the reality is this, that We think that whatever is white, I don't care if that white is not European white, if that white is offshoot white, you know, Chinese, you name it, I don't give a damn. If that's what it is, somewhat that is better than an Ubuntu. It's than a Bantun rather. It's better than a black person. I'm Bantun. That's who I am. I'm black. I'm proudly black. Will ever forever be black. And the reality is this: I will not sit on the sideline and allow anybody else to think about me being different. We have the skill sets to solve the issues of the continent as long as our eyes are focused on us. We have to build our society. Don't blame the white person. The white person is building the white person's society. That's the reason why most of us flee, you know, our own countries, and we basically settle in the West. Why? Because we saw that the West was a whole lot more beautiful, a whole lot more better than where we are. But the truth of the matter is, we need to create a continent that white folks need to also start migrating to this part of the world, all right, to the continent of Africa, not just for games, not just for safari, not just to come and see animals. Unfortunately, I'm sure they're looking at giraffes and also looking at us too. We need to create something that's a little bit more robust, more beautiful, so that, you know, the whole entire continent will not become safari, where humans too become part of the games and part of what is it that they come to watch. Because in my opinion, that's exactly what I see happening.
It's all about shaping the narratives, of course, agenda settings on the African continent. Now, in your opinion, before we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Point, how can African leaders address this issue of insecurity, mostly the problem linked to rebel attacks across Africa? Because we're shifting the focal point from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're seeing rebel attacks in other African countries, and yet, up to date, the countries are yet to be able to resolve this issue of insecurity and rebel attacks. How do they go about addressing it?
There are three types of African in the political sphere. Three. First, the African that listens to the West, all right, or anybody else. West, East, South, it doesn't matter. West and East, you know, primarily. That's the first kind of African. And this kind of African are those who basically, you know, are running. Those are those in power. These are men who are our presidents. These are people who are holding one position or the other. Those are the guys that listen to the West. That's the first type of African in the political sphere. The second type of African in the political sphere is the one who basically do not understand that there is something called elections, who do not understand that there is something called the rule of law, who do not understand that there are times when you need to be able to get, you know, your hands dirty in relationship to trying to be able to mobilize the people, you know, so that you guys can be able to fight, and not just fight with the barrel of a gun, but fight with the political process, so that you can help everyone else, you know, bring all of them together, bring communities together to understand your vision, and then elect you into power. That's the second type that basically do not understand that. And so what they do is they sit on the sidelines and then push young people to go and kill themselves, push young people to commit some of the worst atrocities while they're hanging out in the West. Most of the atrocities being committed on the African continent is being committed by people who are not even living in Africa. They sit behind TV screens, behind computer screens, they hide behind WhatsApp messages and, you know, and ghost social media accounts to commit such atrocities on the African continent, and in doing so have no conscience at all when men, women, and children are being slaughtered and murdered on our continent. The third, you know, group are those who are Pan-Africans, people who basically believe that we need to be able to solve Africa's problem with an African mindset. And if we just brought in the third group, I'm telling you, we will be able to overcome the first and the second group. And because everybody else will understand that whatever we are doing is for us, by us, and it's going to be an African ideal. The last thing I'm going to say about this is this. I'm a Christian, all right? I'm a Christian. I'm a practicing Christian. And the only reason why I'm a practicing Christian is because I have a series of psychological, things that has pushed me, not even spiritual, psychological, that has pushed me onto this particular framework of being a Christian. But my practice of Christianity is first century Christianity. I am not Eurocentric. I don't, whatever is Eurocentric. So I define a lot of things so far as my Christianity is concerned. That being said, I do not also believe that Africa and Africans should be able to hold on to any religious idea at the expense of basically taking a knife and destroying property or killing their fellow Africans in the name of religion. When I see what's happening in northern Nigeria, when I see what's happening in the Sahel, when I see how young men in East Africa, when I see how young men will basically strap themselves up with bombs to destroy a whole entire community, in the process dying because some sheikh, somebody told them that if they were going to do so, then heaven, was going to open up for them and whatnot. I'm telling the young man, I said, wait a minute, I think that you probably might want to postpone that trip to this utopia, because that's not guaranteed. What is guaranteed is what we can create here. Why do you have to believe in a utopia, some glorious place that is coming, when we can be able to create that environment here? When that person, if you were going to take that particular individual and then give them another opportunity to be living in a place like New York, all right, not New York now because it's crazy, but to living in a city that is as beautiful, maybe even Dubai, the person will think twice about what is going on. Why are we not having those kind of attacks in some of these other Muslim nations? Why are most of these attacks taking place only in nations that are quite not Islamic? Because everybody needs to be converted and to be forced into believing, into whatever it is that they are trying to force people to believe. That being said, Christians are not also better. Then for me, my idea is this: we all together must be able to approach the aspect of religion from an Afrocentric perspective. We are Africans first, number one. We are human beings first, number two. And whatever is in between comes later. Nobody is ever born as a Muslim. You were never born as a Christian. You were born into a Christian family. That did not make you a Christian. You were born into a Muslim family. That did not make you a Muslim. You believed that and you became that later on in life when your consciousness began forming. My point is this: we need to be able to understand that the first premise of every religion, so far as any religion is concerned, is humanity. They are human beings that are Christians. They are not antelopes. They are not gorillas. They are not moths. They are humans. We don't have fishes that are Muslims. We don't have fishes that are Christians. You must have to be a human first before you become part of any other religion. If we just understand on the African continent that we are humans and Africans, then the issues of religious intolerance will have no place in our society and in our community. And if that was going to be the case, I think basically looking at Pan-Africans who basically rule things and looking at us as Africans and humans, everything will be okay for us as peace and stability on the African continent is concerned.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. We'll be discussing this aspect that Burundian government has detained troops over their refusal to be deployed to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we have been analyzing this with our guest, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Now, quickly wrap up today's edition, Dr. Stanley. Now, in your opinion, what is the way forward?
The way forward is this: let's Rwanda, let's Burundi, let's the DRC, let's Rwanda, Uganda, let them come together and basically find ways to solve this issue. And then the thing I will absolutely encourage more than anything else is this: that if you're a rebel in the DRC and if you are taking marching orders to kill another black person that looks exactly like you are fighting in the wrong war. You are fighting in the wrong war. Anyone that looks like you is not your enemy. You have to first of all understand who is their puppet masters, who is pulling strings over their lives. Once you have killed yourself, these men have their own families back home in the West and in the East, and nothing is happening to them. You are the only person who is basically going to suffer, and you are the one who is destroying us as a people. Let us, first of all, see ourselves as Africans, Africans first. Once the African first mindset sets in, everything will be all right. You are African. You supposed to be the one that is the custodian and a caretaker of other Africans. You are not holding the barrel of a gun against your own people. You are holding the barrel of a gun against slavers and everyone who is an invader on the continent of Africa. You have to protect the interests of the African and fight for the salvation of the continent. That is why you have a gun in your hands. Anything else, you are wrong.
It's all about calling or advocating for the liberation of the African continent, of course, enhancing Africa, or calling on Africa to be able to reinforce its potentials for it to be able to get to a point where it sees itself in future. Thank you, Man's Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your insight on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon. Hope to see you soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's at this juncture that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point via your #1 Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. We believe you learned a lot because this was an insightful conversation. Meanwhile, we say thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and to stay in company of our numerous programs on For You Media Africa, another view of the world.